Okay. So we're back with a new season of Communist Radio. Mm-hmm. And we were just talking before about what the kind of theme of this series of episodes is going to be, because we publish a lot of really good podcast material, and we've got Marxist Voice, we've got the Against the Stream, the Spectre of Communism, the Revolutionary Communist International, the Revolutionary Communist Party publish a lot of good podcast material. But we thought, well, what could we add to that without repeating anything? What's missing at the moment? And we were thinking that there's, in general today, on the left, there is this massive vacuum of ideas. I'm not talking numerically, well, that's probably the problem as well, but ideologically speaking, there is nothing coming out of the left. At a time when the right are really on the march, they're coming out with all sorts of they're clearly feeling very confident and optimistic. The left is putting nothing forward. And I mean, we were just talking about this before we came on, Cal, that when I was first getting involved in left-wing politics, there was a lot going on the left. There were ideas being put forward. I got involved in student occupations. There was the anti-fees movement. There was stuff to talk about. There were political, ideological debates happening, and it was beyond the left. It was in society generally. And then, 2015, you had Syriza in Greece. You had Yanis Varoufakis, who thought of himself as a bit of a left intellectual. I think he still does. And he was putting forward various ideas and suggestions for, left-wing policy, and it was rubbish. And all these things, we argued very forcefully against at the time, but at least there was something there. And then it was the same with Corbyn and the people around Corbyn. Yeah. They were putting forward modern monetary theory, all these kind of ideas. But now there's nothing really coming out of the left. And I feel like that's what we can try and address maybe with this series of podcasts that we're going to do is some of the ideological weight that the left needs.
Yes.
And I think it can only really come from the communists. I think that's why it's important that we do it. I
think that's definitely true. I mean, what left, as Alan likes to say.
Yeah, that's right. There's nothing there. I mean, what? It's a complete vacuum there. I mean, and this is important as well because, I mean, Engels, we're all familiar with this. I think that Engels, he talks about the class struggle being fought on three fronts.
Yep. There's
the industrial front. There's not a huge amount going on that front at the moment. Obviously, we had not so long ago, whenever that was, last year, the year before last year.
Maybe the year before now, we're in 2025.
Was it 2022?
2022 was the strike wave.
Yeah. There was a massive strike wave 2022. I can't believe it's that long ago. But there was big struggle on the industrial front there. And then there's the political front. That's the second front, the political one. Well, yeah, there was the general election last year. We participated in that. We've dipped our toe on the political front, I would say. Mm-hmm. But then the third front in the class struggle is the ideological front.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're talking about here. That's what we've got to focus on a little bit now, because no one is battling on that front at the moment. The right is just running riot.
Yeah, and Engels would say nature abhors a vacuum, and it's certainly being filled at the moment by lots of confused ideas coming from the right, as you said, feeling emboldened by the victory of Trump, where the left seem to have abandoned the fight.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think, and this is what we want to talk about specifically today is one particular idea, one particular question that is coming up a lot at the moment on this front, which is the question of immigration. Because the right is putting forward a lot on that. They're pushing very, very hard. And I mean, this is also in the week when reform has topped the polls for the first time.
Yeah.
So it's a question on everybody's minds. I was looking at some YouGov polling at the start of the year that said that immigration was right up there. I think it was number one issue that people were thinking about, that they were concerned about from a political point of view. So it is it's a burning question on a lot of people's minds. It's being discussed all the time in the press. And the right have something to say about it, and the left so far have very little of any substance to say. So I think that's what we should address today.
Yeah.
But obviously this question of immigration, it's not like a new thing. It's not just come up now. It's been around for a long time.
That's the impression you'd get, though, if you believed the press. Often this debate is kind of shrewded in terms that people don't really understand. They talk about natural growth rates. They talk about crises. Very large numbers are thrown around, hundreds of thousands, often accompanied by language about the country being swarmed. And obviously this has put it as a burning question in people's minds. But I think it's worth definitely stating, as you just did, that this is not a new phenomena. And in fact, migration at this scale has accompanied the birth of capitalism and capitalism ever since. It depends where capitalism needs people. Why people, for instance, would up sticks and move, leave behind their families. Depends where the factories are, migration patterns within the country, but also on an international scale as well. So I think it has to be first put in that context to take some of the hysteria out of the debate.
Yeah, it's just part of the capitalist system.
Yes, it is. It's become something of a fact of life. And it's something that the bosses need as well.
Yes.
It flows from the needs of the capitalist system. And there is a kind of irony here, right? That the bosses, of course, benefit from immigration in the form of cheap labor that they can exploit. And at the other hand, they use this question to whip up racism, to further entrench divisions within the working class, which of course come from the top. So it's a profitable problem that they keep on coming back to.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I mean, it combines with what we were saying before about this vacuum being there. We said nature abhors a vacuum. So those political ideas that they rely on, that they use, the racism and so on, that they whip up, the anti-migrant sentiment, which is very useful to them, and we'll come back to that in a bit more detail later. But that, in a vacuum, is getting a big echo. That's the point.
Yeah.
And this is why you see, at a time when the Labour government is completely hated already, hasn't been in power very long, it's already completely hated. There's nothing else on the left. I mean, that Labour government is not very left anyway, but there's certainly nothing else on the left. And so those political ideas start getting a bit of traction, basically.
Yes, yeah. And I think we should put it in the framework of the last 20 years as well. Because obviously we've seen the back of the Tories. A lot of workers were enthusiastic for that rather than the victory of a Starmer government.
Yes.
A lot of people have been duly let down by the man that promised nothing in the first place. But you kind of see the seeds of what would become the hostile environment in the Blair Brown years. Yes. You saw the detention centres for immigration, where immigrants would be treated worse than criminals.
Yes.
You saw the rhetoric around British jobs for British workers. Obviously, that led to the infamous mug at the Labour Party conference, I think, under Ed Miliband at that point. And so they've played with this issue for a long time. Now, I'd say that the Tories took this to a whole new level as part of their culture war rhetoric. And they're a conscious strategy to kind of divide the country over cultural issues, over things like immigration. They start going to war with the United Nations. They say to hell with the Refugee Convention, all of this sort of stuff, this kind of anti-establishment rhetoric that they played into. But I remember just last year when Starmer was in the opposition and he was talking about how migrants should be treated with dignity and compassion. But where's that now?
Yeah.
He's in power.
Yeah.
So the opportunity has been passed to him.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I mean, what you were saying there about like this context is the way the Tories have put it forward, their culture war, they have tried to come across with this question, and Donald Trump's the same in the US, as anti-establishment on this point, using this point to paint themselves in an anti-establishment way. A lot of Brexit was also around that issue, and actually Brexit was seen as the anti-establishment position, largely or partly because of, or was certainly very closely tied up with the racism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. And what's interesting is that, yes, Reform are top of the polls at the moment, and a lot of their policies are anti-migrant and, kind of dog whistle racism and xenophobia. But a lot of the people who support them, actually, looking at the polling, they don't hold those positions on immigration. Yes. They actually support them because they are anti-establishment, and they explicitly say that. Yeah. And in fact, there was over the weekend just gone, there was an interesting report in the I newspaper that quoted a Labour MP who said that he is feeling the pressure, the general disgust and hatred with the government. He's feeling the pressure on the one hand from the Green Party, he said, especially young people moving increasingly towards the Greens because Labour is seen as moving to the right. On the other hand, he said, we're facing pressure from Reform. And he said and the specific thing about Reform, he said, is that Reform have promised to renationalise water. And that's cutting through to people. So it's not necessarily just about immigration. The point is, there is a vacuum there. There's this long history that you've just outlined of relying on these divisions between people, whipping that up for political purposes, political reasons, that's kind of developed a bit of a logic of its own. And now it is occupying that, or trying partially to occupy that anti-establishment space, because there is no left-wing alternative being put forward.
I think that's it. And I think at this point we should talk about the real concerns that people have, because though immigration, as you said, is a key concern of ordinary people, the solutions to the problems of ordinary people lies outside of immigration. And when you talk to these people, when you hear them speaking, whenever we've come across them on paper sales, people that are allured by reform, they're not always dyed-in-the-wool reactionaries, racists, and we should be very clear on that. They have very genuine and earnest concerns about the state of the country. They talk about things like unemployment. They talk about the housing crisis. And as Marxists, I think it's really important for us to give an explanation as to why these things exist, right? Because if you can't, then you are allowing the right wing to grow. Because I think what this rise really reflects is the fertile ground for right wing ideas, for populist ideas to emerge when a proper alternative isn't being presented. And in fact, in preparation for this podcast, I was trying to find what the lefts were in fact saying. And I came across a quite jarring interview of Owen Jones. He was on a chat show.
Like most of his interviews.
Yes, yeah. And immigration comes up as an issue, and he makes a very clever kind of cold economic argument for it. He says, well, when we break it down into all of these different categories, it's students coming in and they contribute this to the economy. People were calling up and saying, but the country is strained. You know, what this person was trying to get across is, don't we have enough problems to deal with ourselves? And really, when you don't present a political alternative, when you don't explain that this question is down to these issues are down to the crisis of capitalism, and you don't present a socialist alternative, the benefits of a planned economy, why, for instance, there has been so little public money put into housing, why, for instance, the NHS has been consciously underfunded, then you're not really answering the question. You actually come across very aloof.
Yeah, do you know what? I actually had a conversation with a friend quite recently. We were talking about Donald Trump and the fact that his election win and his subsequent policies and so on. I was talking with this friend, and she said, "Oh well, it's because all those people who voted for him, they're just idiots, aren't they? It's just stupid." And I said, that's exactly how the Democrats have got themselves into the position that they're in. Not that they're just bourgeois liberals basically, and it's very similar to what you just described there in relation to Owen Jones. Because the only argument you can make is to say, when people, like in this case, like you were just describing, people calling up and saying, but the country's going down the pan. You have to say, yes, it is.
Yes, yeah.
You can't say, no, everything's fine. It's absolutely, all these immigrants, everything's fine. Lots of immigrants, but nevertheless, everything is fine. And people are saying, no, there is a problem.
Yeah.
And what Nigel Farage is saying is, Donald Trump is, the problem is immigrants. Yeah. Now that's wrong. That's not true. And we'll come on we'll prove that in a moment. But he says, the problem is immigrants. And if all the left is saying is, no, there's actually no problem, which is Owen Jones, the Democrats, whatever, saying, no, everything's fine, then of course those people are going to react badly against that, because it's true, there is a problem. Living conditions.
People feel like they're being gaslit.
yeah, exactly. And yet this is mainly what comes out of the left, I think. I mean, all you really get is there's not any serious voices. All you get is like the kind of Corbyn style, and obviously Corbyn's still around, and the people around Corbyn, they have this kind of moralistic approach to this question of migrants and refugees. The SWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, has this slogan also, like, refugees welcome here. It's a kind of lovey, like, give them all a hug. It's Corbyn's nicer kind of politics. And so these people are saying there's a problem. The NHS is in a bad way, housing's in a bad way, education, there's not enough money, my kids can't get a place at a good school, and so on and so on. And the answer to that can't we all just be a bit nicer and kinder to each other? Can't we just welcome refugees? It doesn't answer people's problems. It doesn't answer the point. And so there's nothing serious coming out of that kind of reformist left. But then on the other side, in response to that, some people recognise that. They recognise that's not enough. Others on the left. I'm thinking here about like the Communist Party, for example, the Communist Party of Britain, the old Stalinist party. And they this extends also into like some of the, I would say, some trade union leaders, some of the trade union bureaucracy. They would accept what I just said about the nicer, kinder thing. And you can't just say, oh, refugees should be welcome, because it doesn't really answer people's points. It doesn't answer their problems. They would accept that. And they say, therefore, and then they go off in completely the wrong direction. They say, therefore, we should be in favour of some immigration controls, managed migration and so on. This is the slogan that they put forward. And actually they say like, we should keep some of these foreigners out. And they end up parroting and tailing behind Starmer, for example, and even the Tories and even Reform and Farage. They end up just clinging onto their coattails and following them. So there's nothing serious coming out of the left. It's either that kind of weak, insubstantial, like surface level moralism, or it's just clinging onto the coattails of the Labour right, who in turn are clinging onto the coattails of the actual right in the form of Farage.
Yeah, I would say as well, when the reformists talk about this, they frame it in terms of neoliberalism. And that to them is just a set of unfortunate ideas that could be changed. Therefore, what they're implying, at least, whether or not they recognise this, is a nicer kind of form of capitalism is possible. Which we would say is not the case.
And that's their whole... The whole left reformist argument of managed migration is pure reformism. It's the idea that you can have a state that manages the level of workers, so the workers have good wages, and you let some in, and you can be nice about it. It's pure reformism. And actually, the latest issue of our paper, which is out today, the latest issue of The Communist, its centre pages are on Labour in power, going all the way back to the 1920s. Up to today, and its various attempts and failed attempts at managing capitalism in various different ways. And this is just another argument for that. It's not at all, obviously, what communists say about the question. And this is where we should go into a little bit, like what is the communist, the Marxist position on this stuff? Because it's not a new question, and actually Marx himself dealt with this.
Just on something you said before about managed migration, it's all well and good for the labour leaders to talk about how the labour movement should regulate the flow of labour into the country. But that's not really what is being put forward, because the labour movement is not in that position at this moment in time.
That's true.
So who are you appealing to manage migration? The bourgeois state, people, the bureaucrats in Whitehall? Have they shown any particular willingness to be nice and gentle and kind?
Of course not.
To immigrants, to refugees, to those seeking asylum to become refugees in this country? Of course they haven't. So when you break it down like that, you see that it's this dependence upon the bourgeois state, which I think is so characteristic of reformists.
Yes, that's exactly it. And that, as I say, that was never the position of Marx. So, I mean, I think probably everybody knows the basics about Marx. Everyone knows that Marxists are internationalists. That's in the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite and so on. But in terms of what that actually meant and some of the policies that flow from that, this was outlined by Marx. There was a congress in 1867. It was the second congress of Marx's organisation, what's commonly known as the First International, held in Switzerland. And Marx gave an address to the First International it was on the preparations for that. And he makes this point about migration, basically, about people moving to a different country to work and so on, and what should the policy of the First International be towards such people. And it was a major question at the time. It was a major question everywhere, but in particular in England. Because there was a lot of Irish labour coming over, and it was being used, the Irish workers were being used to undermine the English labour movement, basically. He even describes in one letter that he wrote around that time, a couple of years later after that Congress, actually, he talks about these two camps that exist in England, the Irish proletarians and the English proletarians, and they are pitted against each other, he says. And what the point that he makes, I mean, that's obvious, and that's the case today. And I've seen chatter online on social media from people who say, well, look, Marx pointed this out, and therefore Marx was not in favour of, this is the conclusion they draw. Clearly they haven't actually finished reading the article that they're talking about, but The conclusion that they draw is therefore Marx is in favour of keeping the Irish out. That was not at all what if you finish reading the article or the address or the letter or whatever it is you're reading of Marx, he talked about this in various different places. What you see is his proposed solution is that what needs to happen is unity of those opposing camps.
Yes. And he places the responsibility of that primarily on the English workers.
That's right.
On the oppressor nation, which is significant. And I think that observation that Marx made plays out in many different countries. Of course, he's talking about England at the time, which was the most advanced capitalist country. And this issue had been used, as you were saying, to create what seemed like two working classes. And for the bourgeois in England to appeal to the English working class to say, your lives are better off without the Irish, even though it was the bosses that depend upon the Irish.
They were the ones bringing them over.
Exactly. But it kind of creates this false solidarity between the white worker, the white English worker, and the English bourgeois. And Marx, from that observation, explains that since this is a fact, since the bosses are playing both sides in a way, right? They depend upon this cheap, exploitable form of labor in the form of the Irish coming over, but they also their rule depends on appealing to the white English working class as well. Since this is a fact, what are you to do in that situation? Of course, you need to build a bridge between on a class basis. You need to not talk about managed migration, but international solidarity, about organizing the Irish workers. And I think this is the thing that's obviously lost in, well, maybe not a misreading. It depends how ingenuous you find these people.
But yeah, like this is the point, and it's entirely tied up with Marx's understanding of capitalism, because he points out that even at this time in the 1860s, capital is an international force. Capitalism is an international system, and the point he makes in this address to the First International in the preparations for this Congress in Switzerland, he says that the national organizations have become limited because capitalism is an international system. You cannot fight it on a national basis because the bosses can reach overseas and bring workers in to undermine the labor movement in that particular country, and all these various tricks that they have and these things that they can do because of the nature of the system at that time.
Strike breaking as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what the Irish workers were used for, basically. Drive down wages, break the strikes, and so on. He says, therefore, the national organizations are limited. They have to become international organizations. Yes. They have to organize across national lines, basically. That's literally why he formed the First International. It was for that purpose.
Absolutely.
And one of the key policies then, he makes that point, and then he says, and this is touching on what you were just saying about how to build that bridge between, for example, the English and the Irish. One of the key points that he makes is that this is a letter he writes in 1870 where he's saying, look, England, the main capitalist imperialist power in the world at the time. For that reason, it's particularly important that a socialist revolution takes place in England, and the job of the First International is to try and hasten that revolution. He says the only way that you can hasten that revolution in England is through the emancipation of the Irish working class from the yoke, from the domination of English capital. Yeah. And that therefore the English working class, certainly the First International and the English working class in general, has to fight for the emancipation of Ireland. Yes. It has to build solidarity. Well, it was on that basis you can build solidarity with the Irish workers to say, look, we have we do not align ourselves with the English bosses in the exploitation and domination of you, the exploitation of you, the domination of Ireland. Actually, we are for the emancipation of Ireland from the yoke of English imperialism, and on that basis, you can build a united labour movement.
Absolutely. And this is how national oppression is overcome. It's in this joint struggle. Engels makes this point a little bit later, referring to Poland, where he says, a nation that oppresses another cannot be free itself, which I think is a very powerful point to make. And I think what you find with Marx and Engels and later Lenin and Trotsky is internationalism is the key consideration in their understanding of how to build a bridge between the workers, not pandering to certain prejudices. And this really sets, I think, Marx apart from, and Lenin later, from kind of the more opportunist trend in the labour movement that panders to the prejudice within backward sections of the working class, because they don't believe that a transformation is possible. They don't think that consciousness, the backward ideas in consciousness, can be overcome through struggle. But of course, that has been shown in many instances.
Yeah, exactly. And these arguments that Marx was making then, they were carried through, this runs through the entire history of the communist movement, because so Marx, his organisation was the First International. There was an organisation that came later, the Second International. And this exact same debate came up, the question of migration controls.
Yes.
And it was 1907, there was a Congress in Stuttgart. And this question was debated. I mean, we don't really have time to go into all the background of the Second International now. There's lots of material that people watching can read if they would like to find out more about the Second International. But it was in a situation at that time where there was some basically degeneration going on. There was opportunism. There was a right-wing tendency inside that international that basically was looking for compromise, collaboration with the bosses, and those ideas were becoming reasonably strong in the Second International even at that time. That, by the way, eventually is what sank the Second International.
Yeah.
That came a few years later. But certainly in 1907 at that Congress, a lot of the questions that were a bit disputed were brought to the fore there. So they were discussing, for example, the colonial question, women's emancipation, and also this question of immigration. And what you had was right-wing delegates, and they were typically from the more powerful, older capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, Britain, Germany. I think the US delegate also spoke on this. And they were arguing that people from countries that were backward in their development or not as caught up in their development should not be allowed, that the international, this so-called Marxist international, well, it was a Marxist international at that time, but basically the Marxist international should take a position that these people should not be allowed to migrate. Because it would undermine, because they didn't have traditions perhaps of a labour movement in the country they were coming from, and therefore they wouldn't be organised, and they would undermine the labour movement in the country that they were going to. This argument was put forward by the right-wing delegates. And it was very fiercely debated, including by Lenin, who was completely 100% opposed to these. He participated in these debates, and he was completely opposed to that position. He said that is a completely reactionary line. And actually it was some other US delegates actually, and the Italian delegates, who argued forcefully against that. And they made the same point that Marx made. They said, actually, our position should not be that we don't want people to come to our countries. Actually, our position should be that they should come and we should organize with them. And they can join us in the struggle against capitalism, against imperialism in these imperialist countries.
Absolutely. And I think this is a point that Lenin, I'm not sure if he made it at the Congress, but he writes about it in letters over the years. He talks about how migration and the development of capitalism across the world is progressive because it breaks down national barriers. It further integrates the working class. I mean, the working class today has never been more integrated, dependent upon one another. And it gets rid of this kind of craft provincialism that existed before, especially in Marxist day. But it's these kind of attitudes that surface in the trade unions as well, where they say that a certain section of the working class is either too backward. I'm sure they wouldn't use that language nowadays, but they would say they are unorganizable. Like they are too poorly integrated into society to really be considered part of it. So there's this dark underbelly of the labor market that is just there for the bosses to exploit.
Raw material for exploitation.
Exactly.
Yeah, and look, this is absolutely the case for this question of migration, for example, and immigrant labor. It's also the case, and these were debates that were happening at this same time. It was a bit before this Congress we're talking about was 1907. But before that, especially in England, the late 1880s, the 1890s, this debate was going on then as well, but about the unskilled labor, basically. In the docks, for example, in the gasworks. A lot of this was going on in East London, where we are now. And there was a big debate at the time. There were trade unions that existed, But they were what were known as craft unions. They only organised skilled workers, and they were extremely prejudiced against unskilled workers.
Yeah.
And they said, to be honest, they are completely unorganisable. There's nothing that can be done with them. They should just be kept out of our unions and, left, as you say, left at the mercy of the bosses. But in the late 1880s and 1890s, there was a massive movement among those workers. And they were all taking strike action. It was all wildcat action. None of it was organised, really, because they didn't have unions.
Yeah.
But it proved to be an extremely powerful force in the labour movement. Engels wrote a lot about this. It was called the New Unionist Movement.
Yeah.
And they formed, in the course of that struggle, trade unions, which became some of the most militant trade unions. Mm-hmm. They proved that they were not only organisable, but when organised, some of the most militant fighters against the bosses and against the capitalist system, and for socialism in some cases.
Yes.
One of the unions that was formed at that time, you can trace its lineage to the present day in the form of the RMT, which is one of the most militant unions in the country at the moment, and has in its constitution the need to fight for socialism.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's specifically in the case of the trade union movement and organised or skilled versus unskilled workers and so on.
It also, it could be said as well, I'm thinking about the matchsticks strike.
Yeah, the match girl strike.
Match girl strike that took place in Bow. They raised, from what I remember, an enormous amount of money from international solidarity campaigns, right? From across the borders.
Yes.
And a lot of these currents that were inspired by this initial strike, the gas workers, for instance, in East London, a lot of that energy went into forming the Labour Party just a little bit longer.
Yes, that's true. That came just afterwards. So you can make the same, you could see the same arguments, basically. You could see the contours were the same in this debate around migrant labour. Excuse me. This debate around migrant labour. It was the same kind of arguments, basically. As you say, there was this craft attitude on the one side, keep them out. They won't understand these immigrants. They can't be organised. They can't be integrated into our labour movement. Versus Lenin's position, the communist position, which is no, of course they can be organised and they can be some of the most militant fighters. And the class struggle, the labour movement in the receiving country can actually become much stronger as a result.
Yes.
Lenin wrote a lot on these questions, and it was also covered, I think, in he wrote various letters and articles. And and by the way, that Stuttgart Congress, it came down on Lenin's side in the end. The vote went to the left, not to the right, and they described as reactionary by nature the idea of migration controls, and put forward instead a whole series of measures, a whole series of suggestions for how to strengthen the labour movement in the receiving country of these migrants, which included, for example, making sure that migrants had the same pay and conditions as workers who are already in the country, and kind of levelling the playing field like that. And they also made a number of points about how the trade unions needed to make a conscious effort to organise those workers.
Yes,
It was also covered, I'll point out as well, in 1922, the fourth Congress of the Third International, which was led by Lenin and Trotsky in the Theses on the Eastern Question. I won't go into it for lack of time, but this also covers that exact same point. So there's plenty of kind of history that we can look to for our understanding and our ideas around this question. But what are we saying today then? So obviously a lot of our comrades who are listening to this, they'll be out actively building the Revolutionary Communist Party. Yep. They'll be in meetings, they'll be on stalls on the street, selling the paper, whatever. Someone comes up to them and says, okay, so what do communists think about immigration? All these immigrants coming over here.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that? What do the communists say about that?
I already mentioned it, but I'd start by saying that the problems that ordinary people face lie outside of immigration. Immigration is a fact of life. It's something that has obviously been taken to a very high degree by the needs of the capitalist system itself. But the issues that people face around housing, let's take housing, for instance. The housing shortage we have today is a direct result of Thatcher's policies for the right to buy and the conscious lack of money going in to social housing. Let's take the NHS, for instance. In the healthcare system, this has been consciously underfunded since the Blair years, really, relative to other European healthcare systems, in order to make the case for privatization, So now, whenever the NHS is mentioned, it's a bureaucratic mess, right? We throw so much money at it, but it can't be fixed. This has been part of a conscious strategy to open up the healthcare system, a major gain in the post-war period to particularly American corporations. When we look at unemployment as well, this has been a constant scourge in society. Marx explains this, the needs in times of boom to fill the factories and then to throw them out at times of crisis. But it's become this permanent scar because the capitalists won't invest. So I would say that the anger that people rightly feel needs to be directed at those that own the factories, that own the industry. And I think if we pivot the conversation in that direction, actually what you usually find is a lot of hatred towards the billionaires, towards the bosses who of course benefit from modern slave conditions in Britain, from this super exploitable labor and so on.
I think it reminds me, what you just said there reminds me of in the election campaign in the summer.
Yes, of course.
Because there was a door that we knocked on, I remember, of a guy who, he basically did ask this question. He said, well, what about immigration? It was Fiona, our candidate, who answered who was there knocking on the doors. And who answered this point, and he said, well, immigration, that's a problem. It's true, like in Stratford and Bow, in Newham, that borough, there's a real shortage of housing and everything else. It's one of the most overcrowded parts of the country, in fact. And what you just said is exactly how Fiona answered it. She said, look, it's not because there's lots of immigrants coming over, there's a shortage of housing or hospital beds or school places. It's because there is enormous amount of wealth in the country. It's just not being invested properly.
Yes.
And that's the real problem, and that's why we should direct our anger. And yet, interestingly, what he said was, do you know what? I actually agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I'm just going to vote Reform because they're better known and they've got more of a profile and so on. This is going back to what we were saying before about there being a vacuum and the rights filling it and so on. But the point is that argument is very easy to make, and there's a really good. It does the rounds sometimes on social media. And I quite like it. I think I was talking about this with a comrade just before we came in here. It's a good visual representation of the problem. It's the one with this plate of cookies, and there's a British worker, an immigrant worker, and a boss. And the boss has taken the entire plate of cookies except one, and then is saying to the British worker, "That immigrant worker's trying to take your cookie, mate."
Yeah.
When the problem is the boss has taken the whole lot. I think that's quite a succinct representation.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think it's quite normal to come on in these conversations to the artificial scarcity that exists in society, right? It's not the case that not enough houses exist in this country, right? That couldn't be filled. I mean, we're doing this podcast from London where housing has just become a plaything for the rich, right? It's for financial speculation of people that don't even live here. Lots of building projects taking place all across London now are not affordable for ordinary people. So there are the houses, there is the food, there is the money to go into education, to actually building this country up. But that's not what's happening. Yeah. And I think we have to give a proper explanation as to what we would do differently. Because I feel like this is where a lot of the left falters. They diagnose the problem, or they make their economic arguments, or they appeal to their moralism, but they don't explain why we need to expropriate the wealth of the billionaires. Yes. They don't explain why we need to take over the commanding heights of the economy, and what workers' control and planning would actually look like, and how that could affect people's lives. Without that, if we don't have that, we are just giving ground to the right wing to tap into this issue.
Yeah, we've got to make that case for a planned economy under democratic workers' control. And it's certainly not enough to try and, regulate capitalism. Mm-hmm. Because as long as you leave the power in the hands of the capitalists, they will continue to find ways to enrich themselves at the expense of everybody else, not invest, for example, in things that need investing in, any of the things that make them a profit.
Yes.
Which, by the way, includes illegal migrant labour.
Yeah. I'm glad you raised that, because I wanted to come on to this question. I've often found when seeing lefts on talk shows and this sort of thing online, that they really falter at this question, legal versus illegal. And of course, most right-wing hosts, very disingenuous, and they talk about illegal migrants as if that means criminal, that means unwanted people that we don't want in the society that are causing societal ills and stuff. But in fact, it's the bosses that benefit the most from this debate, and creating a situation where illegal migrants, people without the correct paperwork, like for instance what we see in America at the moment with Trump's deportation threats, who is that benefiting? If you're an American boss, you basically hold this legal migrant in bondage, right? It's very similar across actually a lot of Europe. There is a lot of undocumented workers in Italy, and the right wing play up this threat. They're taking your jobs. Actually, the jobs that they work are often some of the most menial, some of the most hard. They don't have proper terms and conditions as a result. So it's the bosses that benefit from this.
Yes.
And I do find in the British press, when they comment on these things, that they occasionally slap the odd employer on the wrist. They make out as if, there's this rogue company and we're taking the right action. But what about things like the dark factories in Leicester, the garment factories, where people are paid £3, £4 an hour in order to keep up with the demand of fast fashion, companies like Boohoo employing people there. So this has been known about for decades.
Everyone is aware of that.
Everyone knows about that, right? And every couple of years, we find out about this criminal network operating of Polish people. I think in the Midlands back in 2019, a massive modern slave network was found in the Midlands. But and these people had been brought over with the promises of better lives. Are these the problem? People that have come here under false pretenses and are being ruthlessly exploited, or is it the people that are bringing them here in the first place?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And those people, those bosses, those capitalists who are exploiting that labour, who benefit off that, they also benefit off doing the opposite, basically, from a political point of view, which is to demonise those people and whip up racism and xenophobia against them, which is in overdrive at the moment, especially around the Southport question, for example. Politicians from all parties are really relying on those Southport killings to whip up anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-immigrant. In fact, there's a good article on this again in the issue of the paper that has just come out today. But yeah, on the one hand, they rely on these illegal immigrants, undocumented migrants, and so on to as a source of profits, people they can exploit to the maximum, drive down the wages of other workers and so on in the country. On the other hand, they also benefit politically from whipping up anger against those exact same people.
Yes, yeah, for sure. When I was doing some research for this podcast, I came across a pretty shocking statistic that I found on the UK government's website, that modern slavery is predicted to be 130,000 in the UK. And that affects things like the agricultural sector, fruit picking for supermarkets. It affects, in particular, the construction sector. And if you go on this report, I think it's in the National Crimes website, it goes into the drudgery and degrading conditions that people like this face. And a lot of these people that are here without documentation have been brought here, as I was saying before, under false pretenses. I remember actually reading a lot about the, what was it called? The Calais jungle in France, when Fortress Europe was trying to keep as many refugees and people seeking asylum out. And there was a report written by the French police that said that the traffickers are in cahoots with very powerful people. He said bankers in France, and he actually described the operation as being on an industrial scale. The amount of money that these people were expected to cough up was 6,000 euros or something like that to make this really, really dangerous journey across the waters. I mean, the Channel, much like the Mediterranean, has become a graveyard for migrants that are kept out by border defense and so on. But when they get here to this country, they are ruthlessly exploited by the bosses, and they have no scruples. They don't give a damn. Actually, in some cases, they would prefer, if you are an illegal migrant seeking or a refugee seeking a far lower standard of living, standards of expectation than a British worker.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the question that the labour movement needs to ask the trade unions, the left in general, is when you're looking at these people, are you looking at them as a threat, or Or are you looking at them as actually potential allies in the struggle against these bosses who are doing that exploitation?
Exactly.
And I think that's the main point we need to get across. That's the point that Marx made. That's the point that Lenin made. This needs to be the policy of the labour movement.
Yes.
Is not to talk about managed migration, for example. It's also not just to talk in general moralistic terms about how we love refugees. It's to organise them. It's to get them ready. It's to get them to participate in the class battles that take place in this, that are already taking place in this country. Yeah. And there are examples of this historically working quite well. I vaguely remember this from the time, actually. It was just as I was getting interested in politics. But 2009, there was a strike, an oil refinery strike, Lindsey Oil Refinery, although it actually spread to other oil refineries as well. And it was a strike there was a European contractor had come in, Italian, I think they were. And they'd come in and they got some contract and they were bringing their own workers over from Italy and Portugal, I think. And they were paying them a lot less than the British workers who currently did those jobs were being paid. And the whole thing was seen by the British workers, by the trade unions, as this attempt to drive down the wages of the British workers. And so they went on strike. Now, that was portrayed in the media at the time as basically a racist strike. And that was not what it was like at all. In fact, I remember we interviewed, not me specifically, but people involved at the time. We interviewed people who were on strike at that time, and there was no hint of that. In fact, they were making massive efforts to speak to the Italian and Portuguese workers and unite with them. And that really terrified the bosses. In fact, they put up big barriers to try and stop that happening. They were putting the migrant workers on barges, but on prison ships, basically, away from the British workers so that they couldn't talk to them, so they couldn't swap details, for example, and come up with a common strategy. They were trying to separate them. The BNP, which doesn't really exist anymore, but obviously the far-right organisation, far-right political party at that time, was getting involved, trying to whip up the racism and whip up the xenophobia. And the unions and the workers were pushing back against that, kicking those people out of the protests and so on. The reason the bosses were so scared of that unity across national lines was because that actually had the potential to seriously impact the bosses. And that's exactly what happened. They were able to do that in the end. And the bosses did back down and the jobs were saved and the wages were brought up and everything else.
Yes.
So it gives you a good idea of the real strategy that the labour movement should pursue. When you see these people coming over, whether documented or undocumented, whatever wages they're on, so the policy should be that no foreign worker, no migrant worker should be paid less than or given worse terms and conditions or anything else than the workers in the receiving country and the workers who are already there.
Absolutely. And I just say that often these struggles are complicated by third parties, or that's at least what institutions will say. I'm thinking, for instance, of universities across the country. In London, there's been lots of struggles against outsourcing.
Yes, yeah.
Where you can even see it actually when you're on campus, that a lot of the cleaners, porters,
security guards
will typicly be of migrant workers, and their conditions compare to their white English counterpart. But there's a huge margin. There's a huge pay difference. There's different expectations, this sort of thing. And I would say the lesson that we can draw out of the oil refinery strike is any campaign that's really going to threaten the bosses is going to be one that unites people, no matter what their background, what their ethnicity is. Because of course there is this instinctive drive of the working class to unite and realize that they would be better off, far more better off, if they were to take the struggle against the bosses. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly that. We've got far more in common, irrelevant of what country we're from, with each other than we do with the billionaires and the bosses. Yeah, I think that's it then. I think that kind of sums up our where our line should come from. It comes from Marx, Engels, Lenin, the history of the revolutionary movement, the communist movement. And so this idea that the real enemy is a class enemy. You turn your fire against the capitalist class, against the billionaires and the bosses and the bankers. And we unite across national borders, across different races, nationalities, whatever it is. That's our best bet of struggling against the problems that we actually face.
Absolutely.
As working class people. But yeah, look, I mean, these questions, there's lots more to be discussed and read about on this point. We've probably run out of time on it now. But these kind of questions, I think, that particular question is obviously not going away anytime soon. And there needs to be a robust response from the left. There needs to be a proper kind of ideological argument made, not just moralism, and certainly not tail-ending the Labour right and the right wing. And that's what we've been trying to put across here. We will be doing this more with various other questions, I think. I think we have to, because nobody else is putting it forward. I think this kind of stuff can only come from the communists.
Yeah.
We're not really big enough to fully fill that vacuum that exists out there, but we'll make an effort with this podcast, with our newspaper, with our websites, our theoretical magazine. This is what we're making an effort to do at the moment. I mean, there's various other questions that I think we could discuss. We've had a lot of people writing in with their applications to join at the moment are mentioning the threat from the right wing in general, not specifically on the question of immigration, but in general, the threat from the right wing. A lot of them mentioned fascism, for example.
Yes.
And they're worried about fascism and so on. Well, we can tackle that question. What is fascism? Where does it come from? How do you fight fascism? And to the extent that, what we're seeing today isn't kind of classical fascism, because clearly it's not. There's not jackbooted stormtroopers around the place, and we're still here able to record our podcasts. Like, we're not being shut down by the state or anything like this, or by right-wing, gangs marauding around, although such gangs do exist, obviously. But anyway, we can discuss that in perhaps a little bit more detail on the future podcast. There might be other questions that kind of link to that, as the question of racism, which we could discuss in more detail. Mm-hmm. I mean, there might be other questions as well, and we're interested to hear from people. If there are questions that are coming up that you think the left isn't really offering an adequate answer to at the moment, we would like to hear about it. Write in or leave a comment or whatever. But this is mainly what we're focusing on, isn't it, at the moment in the RCP? I mean, I've just got back from a meeting of the international leadership of the Revolutionary Communist International, and this was the main point that was made there as well. There's this vast vacuum on the left, and we need to focus on ideologically developing ourselves to answer some of these points. Yeah. We had a leadership meeting, a central committee meeting of the Revolutionary Communist Party just a couple of weeks ago. We were both there. And we discussed in detail some elements of Marxist philosophy, for example, Marxist economics, how the capitalist system actually works, why capitalism goes into crisis and so on, to really get to grips with what is actually happening in the world at the moment. And that was very useful. And all over the country now, there are regional leadership events taking place, educational, political schools taking place to really drill into the detail of Marxist theory, of a deep understanding of communist ideas. A few agitational slogans is not enough.
Yes,
in this particular period.
And we'll be at the London leadership meeting this weekend.
That's
in
right.
fact, over 2 days, and lots of different topics that we'll be discussing.
Yeah, what kind of things?
Right-wing populism is one. We'll be discussing the world situation, which is changing every single week, and other topics as well, a little bit more theoretical, historical. The rise of the bourgeois, the decline of feudalism is one of the topics. I'm going to be talking myself on colonial revolutions in the Arab world, drawing a lot on Ted Grant's writings from that period, and a variety of other talks.
Yeah, good. Well, these are good examples of the kind of things we need to get to grips with, I think, in this period that we're in now. This is the main focus of the Revolutionary Communist Party at the moment, and I'm sure lots of our listeners are already involved in the party. And I'd say if you are, really get stuck into this campaign, this political development campaign that we're on at the moment, because this is what's lacking in society at the moment. And if you're not already a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, then you should get involved. I would say that to people as well, and join us in this fight on this ideological front of the class struggle. Yeah. But we'll leave it there for now and come back next week.
Okay.